Someone who has seen the world change around him, like a great many of us over the last few months, has been the head man at the Lucas Group, a great hospitality chain, and the owner of some of the best restaurants in Melbourne, Chris Lucas. And Chris joins us on TheInformer. Chris, welcome. I touched on the fact that the world has changed. So many things have been broken, and business has been hit hardest because you've been told by the government that you can't trade. You never imagined you'd see that day, would you? Or did you?
No, there's no doubt that it's a first for me. I've seen a few things over my lifetime, lived through about 3 recessions, I think, and at almost 60 years of age, I could never have imagined us, George, to see a point where the government's taken away our livelihood, albeit for probably sound health reasons in some respects, but also, that we find ourselves in a never-ending curfew and lockdowns where not only have our businesses been taken away from us, but our democratic freedoms have been taken away from us, and our everyday things that we take for granted. So like walking in the park or going to see our parents. So no, I don't think anyone could have ever envisaged that, not in Australia anyway.
Going forward, Chris, what is the sort of common ground that you'd like to reach right now going forward, whether it's with the government, whether it's with your landlords, whether it's with your workers? What's the sort of common ground? Can we find a way of sharing the risk to get out of this lockdown, to get business back, to get Melbourne functioning again, and to get the hospitality industry back where it should be, and that is thriving in a city that it's made famous over the last half a dozen years as the most livable one that you could ever visit in the world?
Well, that's a very good question, George, because we're now getting to the pointy end of this crisis. Because, to be quite honest, the federal government, the banks, the landlord community, of which I'm part of, I'm a landlord as well as a tenant, and in fact the broader community have done a great deal in coming together to save jobs, save businesses, to put a safety net under the economy to prevent a catastrophic failure of not only just our businesses, but in fact society. Because, George, as you've correctly pointed out in some of your other casts or podcasts, this is turning into a humanitarian crisis. Now, I think that, quite frankly, while we could always want more, I really do think that the support from those various segments of the community, i.e. federal government, banks, landlords, just general population, they've been extraordinary. Humans have come together, especially Australians, George, have come together like I've never seen before, to support each other, to help each other, to offer messages of support like I would never have anticipated. I've had the head of the banks call me up personally to offer their moral support as well as their financial support. I've had over 65,000 emails and messages just in the last 4 weeks from just Victorians, in fact Australians, reaching out and thanking me for standing up and being a voice for them. The one element missing here, George, sadly, is the people who are got all the control over the future of where we go with this virus and this crisis, and that's the state government. The only thing standing our way in terms of getting this crisis behind us as a community and moving on is the government, is the state government of Victoria. And I'm not trying to be critical of them in saying that, but everyone else has done their bit. And now we're faced with a situation where the numbers are starting to drop, as we can see. I think today they're down to 40, and God help us, we hope that they're down to much lower numbers in the weeks to come. And then really, I guess the question is going to be, when will the government then decide to take a more proactive step to reopen the economy and save jobs and prevent this humanitarian crisis, which is building, George, and it's building very, very, very slowly, but it's building in very significant numbers. The 700 deaths that have occurred here in Victoria are very sad, and I'm not trying to point the finger at anyone, but sadly they've occurred, and every life that's lost is a tragedy, and they are someone's parents and grandparents, and it's, the whole thing is a very sad situation. But George, there are literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Victorians that are going to suffer, not just economically, but psychologically. The damage that's being done to our young people, to our teenagers, to our young professionals who have never seen anything like this before, and quite frankly don't have the maturity to cope with curfews and lockdowns and financial pressures, the marriage breakups, the family trauma. When the bankruptcies start to happen, and they will happen, sadly, in our industry alone, we're looking at anywhere between 20% to up to 40% of our industry not reopening or failing in the next 12 months. These are catastrophic numbers, George. 200,000 young people potentially will lose their jobs in the hospitality sector in Victoria between now and Christmas if we can't get this sector reopened. Now, the only people standing in the way is the government. And I can understand what they're trying to do. I mean, I'm sure Mr. Andrews and his ministry and his public service are working diligently to try and save lives. But at what cost? At what point in time do we as a community say that the balance needs to be shifted from a 100% purely health focus to a more balanced approach that takes into account all those things that I've talked about? And I think that's going to be the pertinent question in the next 30 to 60 days. As you know, the government's taken a public position with Mr. Andrews' plan a few weeks ago that says that the economy will not be opened in Melbourne until there's 14 days of consecutive 14 days of zero transmissions, and that in fact we won't reach what he refers to as COVID normal until there's been 28 consecutive days of zero transmissions. Now, that hasn't been achieved anywhere in the world, to my knowledge, and to many medicos and scientists. No one has been able to show us a city of our size where that has been executed. Now, where does that leave us, George? It leaves us in nowhere. It leaves us hanging with no hope, because the community and the business community is also very supportive of trying to save lives and do what we need to do as a community to get over this health crisis. But at some point in time, we also need to provide hope to the 6.5 million Victorians. We can't just continue to live in a curfew and live and be tormented with unrealistic plans that we know are unachievable. We need to be given hope. And I'm really, really fearful that if we can't get the government, the state government, to move the dial slightly away from this very abstract, almost, as I said to you, unachievable target, to something that the community can get behind and say that it's sensible and that we can understand, then we are really facing a crisis that will go well beyond the 700 or 800 lives that we've sadly lost already.
That's a very dark picture that you paint, but you certainly know the industry better than anyone. You've been right in the middle of it for a long, long time. If there's one thing we can get to address to the government, you're saying open as quickly as possible. What else would you like to see? Would you like assistance with payroll tax? Do you think there's some red tape that they can eliminate or at least push to one side? We're hearing from the government that they want to get the restaurants that are traditional in-house dining on the street. What are your thoughts about that?
Okay, so let me say this just for clarity's sake, George. we're not saying open as soon as possible. What we're saying is that we need to adopt an opening plan that's balanced, that takes into account the safety of the community and our workforces, but at the same time takes into account all those other things that I talked about. So we need to get the balance right. So we're saying we're happy to wait till the numbers get down, but we can't wait till they get down to zero, because that might not ever happen. So that's stage one. We must get to that point and redefine what the Premier refers to as COVID normal. His definition of COVID normal is zero transmissions for 28 days. We believe that that's unrealistic, and so does the majority of the scientific and medical community. So we need to go to a definition of what practical COVID normal is. And if you talk to anyone, George, they'll say to you that we have to learn to live with this virus in our communities. So stage one is, let's get together as an industry, as a community, and with our leaders here at the state level, and say, okay, let's get some common sense here. Let's see if we can get a proper practical redefinition of COVID normal. If we can get that, George, then you're referring to these other things that you've raised. These are stage 2 and stage 3. There's what economists refer to as micro and macro reform. Now, things like payroll tax, things like FBT, red tape. George, what's happened in Australia is that we've had 30 consecutive years of positive growth. And as a country, we've been very lucky. And there's been now 2 or 3 generations of young people come into the workforce who have never seen a downturn like they're seeing at the moment. And I think it's resetting the bar. It's questioning our values as both individuals, I think, and as business people. It's forcing us to relook at things. And I think that's a good thing. We're reassessing, for instance, as individuals, you know, even the more fundamental things of what's the meaning of life. I mean, you know, and I think that's a good thing, that it's given us a chance now to potentially reset.
So everything on reset? Is everything on reset?
I'm sorry?
Is everything up for reset?
I think everything is up for reset, George. This is as you said, this is a once in a century crisis. In Australia and around the globe, this probably hasn't happened since the 1918 famous Spanish flu pandemic. And if you read some of the documentation from around the time, it's funny, you know, but in Australia, they shut the borders. And state governments referred to federalism, used federalism to reassert their power at the state level. And a lot of the very similar issues have resurfaced again. And I think it is time for a reset in everything we do. But for our leaders, our political leaders, both at the federal and state level, this is a once in a generation opportunity to see how we can rebuild in a more business-friendly way, because business has borne the brunt of such enormous costs that have been incurred in this unfettered growth period of 30 years that it's now, again, out of balance. George, one statistic that you might not know about that is widely discussed amongst economists is, in Australia today, only 40% of Australians pay tax. 60% of Australians now do not pay any tax, either because they're elderly, they're either out of the workforce, they're on some form of government income, etc., etc. Now, that's unsustainable.
Yeah.
That's unsustainable. The fact that small business in Australia has been crushed through this pandemic because it doesn't have union representation, it doesn't have the muscle, the corporate muscle of big business, but yet it represents, as an aggregate, the single largest employer in Australia.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In Victoria, small business, George, right, represents 1.2 million workers.
It's a great number.
Now, if we can't, and small businesses being crushed under such enormous costs of doing business, that, quite frankly, that is the growth engine for an economy. It's small business. It's entrepreneurship. I think the other thing that's concerning me, George, is that I think in the last 10 to 15 years, and maybe as a consequence of the fact that we've been a very lucky country, we've had this great growth, that we've sort of lost our way a bit as a community. There's been a very disturbing trend, which has been propagated also, I think, through the media and through a rising voice of activism that is really influencing our young people, our next generation of entrepreneurs and leaders. One of the very disturbing things, I think, and you're seeing this in America at the moment, George, you're certainly seeing in parts of Europe, where, this activism is labeling anyone with an opinion that doesn't agree with them as an enemy. And it's resorting to violence. It's resorting to nasty, unprecedented social media campaigns. It's besmirching the good name of people who want to do nothing more than go about their daily life. But if they express an opinion that this minority don't agree with, then all of a sudden you're labelled a climate destroyer or a wage thief or, a nasty, greedy entrepreneur that just wants to rip profits out of people. And yet the statistics don't support that, George. As you know, as I said to you, 40% of Australians now are paying tax, 60% are not. And that can't continue, that trend.
That's a number that really opens people's eyes when you say it, 40%. That's incredible. We'll leave it there, Chris. But thank you very much for taking us through this litany of challenges. And we wish you a speedy return to business, and we want the community in Melbourne to get back and firing on every cylinder. Thank you so very much. Chris Lucas talking to us on The Informer.